Hi everyone, Professor Lamar here, and welcome to our mini lecture video about developmental research designs. Now, developmental research designs are often considered non-experimental research because one of the variables is usually age. You see, developmental research focuses on how people change and develop over the course of their lives. And the thing about age is that we can't randomly assign it to our participants. You are, however old you are, I can't look at you and say, okay, these 50 participants, you're going to be 25 years old, and these 50 participants, you're going to be 35 years old. Can't randomly assign someone's age. You are how old you are, no one can change that. So because we can't manipulate age, that makes developmental research studies that focus on how people change as they get older, it makes these studies non-experimental. There's also different ways that we can study how people change over time. And so let's talk about 3 different types of developmental research. The first method that we'll talk about is called a cross-sectional method. And the way that this works is researchers choose people from different age groups, like maybe they choose a group of children and then a group of adults, and they study them at the same point in time to see if children are different from adults on some sort of value or variable. Now, the cool thing about this is that it's very quick and efficient. Researchers just need 2, they could have more, but they just need 2 groups of people who are different ages. And that's it. They measure them like by giving them a survey or bringing them in for a study or something like that. And then that's it. They're finished collecting data and they can just analyze it. So it's very quick and it's very efficient. But think for a second. Does this really tell us how people change and develop over time? Not necessarily. You see, it gives us a snapshot of how children taken in a present time might feel or behave on a certain construct. And it gives us the same value for adults overall too. But it doesn't tell us how these children will develop into adults because the adults are different people than the children are. Now, this is the disadvantage to a cross-sectional method. It doesn't actually really tell us how people change over time. It just tells us if there's differences in the present time between a younger group and an older group. It's also suspect to what's called a cohort effect, okay? Now, a cohort effect occurs if we see that the developmental experiences that exist for a certain age group are different than the developmental experiences that existed for other age groups. Think about the generation that you're in. Your experiences as a member of that generation are unique, and they're different from the experiences of people who are in other generations. For instance, something that's going to lead to a pretty big cohort effect that we're all kind of living through right now is the COVID pandemic. And kids who are going through this COVID pandemic and using virtual learning this school year, that is going to, if developmental researchers measure things like socialization, like peer socialization in particular, we might see that children who are studying virtually and not going to school face-to-face have different experiences than adults today did when they were children, right? Because many adults today, when they were children going to school, unless they were working remotely or homeschooled or something like that, they were likely in an environment where they were face-to-face with their peers. And that's not the experience for a lot of children today. So all of this is to say that we now have this thing called a cohort effect, where the experiences of one generation are different than the experiences of another. And the COVID pandemic is just one example of this. If we look at like the millennial generation, if researchers were to study development and technology, millennial generation is the first generation that really kind of grew up with the internet and social media and things like that. And so we see that that could be a cohort effect that millennials face. And this exists, again, with every age group, every generation, and cohort effects are a problem because if we look at differences between younger people and older people on a certain variable or characteristic, we might see that there are differences that occur. Younger people are different from older people in some way, but we don't know if those differences are due to age because they could just be due to different experiences that the generation has. I'll say that again and think about really what it means. When there's a cohort effect, this is a problem because if we see that there are differences on whatever variable we're measuring between younger people and older people, that's cool, but we don't know if those differences are due to age. They could be due to the different experiences that that younger group has had and that older group has had. And so what we have here is a cohort effect, and that's why cross-sectional research can't really tell us how people change or develop over time. But why do you think people use them? Because again, they're super quick, they're very efficient, and so it is a good way to get a snapshot to see how people of different ages are different, or maybe not different from one another. Now, if we do want to look at change over time, we can use the longitudinal method. This has, with the longitudinal method, researchers study just one age group at a time. And they work with a certain age group and study them over the course of a very long time. Longitudinal research can take place over 10 years, 20 years, 30, 40, 50, 60, and we can keep going. There are some longitudinal studies that have taken place for decades, which is pretty cool, because if we have the same group of participants, we can really kind of see how people change over the course of their lives. Now, this does give us that snapshot of development, which is awesome, but the downside is pretty obvious. Longitudinal research is incredibly time consuming. If you were to sit down today and start a longitudinal study, and you wanted to do this study for 30 or 40 years, that means that really you're still going to be working on the same project 40 years from now. It's a long time to devote to this. Now, that's not necessarily bad, because again, longitudinal research can be very useful, but it does take a lot of time. It also then takes a lot of money or funding because it is so time consuming. But again, the advantage of longitudinal research is that we really can see how people change over time. We can really look at their development, which is pretty cool. But you might be wondering, okay, well, how can I do a study that's not as long as a longitudinal study? What if I don't have 30 or even just like 10 years to go, or 10 years to do research? Well, you could use the sequential method. You see, the sequential method is kind of like a compromise between the cross-sectional approach and the longitudinal approach. The sequential method works by choosing people of two different age groups. And technically, again, you could have 3 or 4 different age groups if you want, but the most simple sequential method has a younger group and an older group. And these two groups are studied over a period of time, but the length of time is shorter than what you would see for a longitudinal design. So instead of investing, let's say, 20 years into a study, you could use a sequential method and study how people change over the course of maybe just 2 years, or maybe even 1 year if you wanted. And this gives you a quick snapshot of how people change over a short period of time. So you could still look at some development, right? And that's kind of cool. But you also have 2 different age cohorts, a younger group and an older group. So you can compare younger people to older people as well. It does take a little bit longer than the cross-sectional method, but it definitely takes a lot less time than the longitudinal approach, which is great. And we can study development, even if it is just a development that occurs over a shorter period of time. So the sequential method is a good compromise between the other 2 methods that we talked about overall. All right, so now what I'd like us to do is look at these 3 examples, and I want you to choose the best type of developmental research design. Do you think that in these scenarios, we could answer these research questions with a cross-sectional design, a longitudinal design, or a sequential design? All right. So in example 1, PCC researchers are interested in knowing if adults become less extroverted as they get older. What do you think? Do you think this is best answered with a cross-sectional, longitudinal, or sequential approach? Probably longitudinal, because we're interested in how people change as they get older, right? And so although we're starting with a group of adults, we're looking at how these adults change over the course of their lives. So this would be a good longitudinal study. Next, Peyton wants to research if older voters are more politically conservative compared to younger voters. What would be a good design for this? This would be a good example for a cross-sectional study. Peyton is just looking at 2 different groups, older people and younger people, and he wants to, and they want to know if these people are different on a certain construct. That's it. So this is a really easy way that we could do a cross-sectional study. Then finally, LAUSD is considering giving tablets to all students, but they want to know the impact of technology on learning before they purchase tablets for schools. Well, what do you think we could do here? You might know where I'm going with this. We had an example of a longitudinal study, a cross-sectional study. This third one is a sequential approach. This would be a good sequential approach where researchers could look at the impact of technology over a short period of time and then report back to LAUSD, who could then decide if they wanted to give their students tablets or not. So we have 3 different examples, and I want you to look at how really when we come up with different research questions and different topics, sometimes they naturally lend themselves better to certain developmental designs. If we're really interested in how people change or develop over time, we're probably interested in a longitudinal approach. If we just want to know differences between groups who are different ages, then a cross-sectional approach works really well. And if we want to know how people develop over time, but it's not necessarily important to study them over the course of their lives, then a sequential method is probably good. All right, so this brings us to the end of this mini lecture video, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye.